Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
This is Dr. Dan, and this is Freedom Forum Live, streaming every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Facebook, YouTube, X, and Rumble. Tonight, when governments choose to officially recognize and embrace terrorist factions as lawful political state actors, it is signifying an implied endorsement of terrorism as a justifiable tool to solve international disputes. The chilling rise of antisemitism is the inevitable result of legitimizing Islamic terrorist states and publicly supporting their goal of annihilating Jews, Christians, and the Jewish state. World history is clear that Islam has never been a religion of peace. In a nation conquered by Muslim invaders, Jews and Christians, designated people of the book, are given the choice of conversion to Islam, being subjected to a bully tax, or put to death. In the past several decades, we have all witnessed the torture and death of thousands all around the world by Muslim terrorists. The latest is the massacre of Jews, celebrating with joy the start of Hanukkah in Sydney, Australia, on Bondi Beach, unaware of the barrage of hatred and death about to be unleashed upon them. Recently, on Freedom Forum Live, I said that antisemitism, specifically hatred of Jews, is the canary in the world's moral coal mine. As an international and interpersonal tensions, as they rise, Jews become the scapegoat and the excuse for unholy alliances that are fundamentally illogical and defy common sense. Why would any nation voluntarily allow mass immigration of unvetted young men who refuse to assimilate and believe that murdering Jews and Christians is religiously acceptable? We saw the result last week on Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. So I have to ask, is your hometown next? So tonight, I have back with me my guest on Freedom Forum Radio. Live is Steve the tour guide. Steve the tour guide spent half his life in the USA and half in Israel. He served in the Golani Brigade of the Israeli Army. He earned a PhD from Hebrew University in Jerusalem in Greek, Roman, and Hebrew literature of the Second Temple period, as well as degrees in international relations with an emphasis on the modern Middle East conflict and comparative religion. Remember to check out Steve the Tour Guide's channel on YouTube. So, Steve, thank you for returning to Freedom Forum Live to discuss the tragic Islamic terror attack of Jews in Australia, and I'm welcoming you back as a guest on Freedom Forum Live. So let's just start out. Let's talk about the events in Sydney, Australia of last week.
Hello, hello, hello. Good evening to you, Dr. Dan, and to your wonderful audience.
Well, it's good to be back with you, and I'm very happy that you're back here. I'm very sorry for the circumstances. I asked you to come back specifically because this is something that just happened, which was really very disturbing for me. The holiday of Hanukkah is a joyous occasion. It celebrates a great event in Jewish history. the return of Jews to the temple after defeating the Maccabees, defeated their oppressors, and the story that they had oil for only enough one night, they thought, and it lasted for 8. And everyone is very happy to celebrate this holiday. And here on the very first night, terrorism occurs. I think 16 people have now died, 29 or 30 or so have been injured. There were a couple highlights where local people acted as heroes. Two were killed doing it. One ended up in the hospital, but nevertheless, there was death and injury on what should have been a very, very happy night of Jews celebrating the first night of Hanukkah in Sydney, Australia. So I'm giving the microphone and the stage over to you to start off. What's your
Well,
take on all this?
it was sadly all too predictable. Australia, in particular, for the past couple years since October 7, 2023's attacks on Israel, has been following a policy of appeasement and not just appeasing political Islam on the global scene. They were among the first countries to recognize Palestine as a country without any negotiating process with Israel. But they've also, and more importantly, played the role of appeasers to Islamic Brotherhood ideology and those that represent it within their own borders of Australia. And therefore, and by the way, the ruling regime there currently is a left-wing government, and the Jews there have accused the government already for the last couple years of having abandoned their security. There's been many attacks on the Jewish community in Australia already. Synagogues that were firebombed. Uh, this was not the first, but it was obviously the most lethal. So I don't think this was a surprise at all. I don't think this caught anybody off guard. Obviously, if you were a victim of it yesterday, it caught you by surprise because it's traumatic by nature to be shot at like that. But for anyone who's able to sit back and observe from afar without the trauma of being in the moment, it was all too predictable. And our neighbor to the north, Canada, their government is the exact same thing. I'm not sure you know this, Dr. Dan, but Canada has the third largest population of Muslim Brotherhood members as well as officials of leaders living in their borders. In other words, Qatar and Egypt are number 1 and 2. You may recall that Egypt for a time was ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood. Canada is number 3. So it's not a problem unique, excuse me, to Australia. It's also infested our neighbor to the north, Canada. It's infested England, and basically you could say this is a problem in what's popularly coined the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world. And America is not as infested only because we have a population of something like 350 million people here. And therefore, it's not as large a proportion of the society here as it is in Canada, a country of only just over 30 million. Let's say 30. I think Canada has 38 million people. So you have cities in Canada today, like Toronto, in which the Muslim population is nearing 10% of the population. While here in the United States, the population, I think, is something like 1%, maybe approaching 2%, almost being equal to the Jewish population here, but I'd have to double check that. So I'm not surprised. Of course, it's awful. And I don't know what will change it because the political echelon of all these Anglosphere countries refuses to admit the problem. They're in denial that within the Islamic world, you have people coming from the Middle East with these hatreds already, innate to them. And I'm not claiming it's genetic, but I mean innate to them culturally, that they were born and raised with this hatred for the Jews and also for Christians. but then again, I also, and I just feel the need to do this. Even I am correct when I make generalizations, but I also want to cite the heroism of the Muslim man from Syria who is an immigrant to Australia that is probably most people have seen in the video. Risked his life to disarm one of the two terrorists, at least temporarily. He didn't seem to know how to operate the bolt action gun once he had it in his possession. So therefore, he wasn't able to shoot the terrorist, and the terrorist eventually, just picked up another gun and continued the attack. But that guy named, I think his name is Ahmed El Ahmad, deserves a lot of credit. Just as we, the Jews, honor what's known as the righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, Poles, Ukrainians, Germans who hid Jews during the Holocaust and therefore went against the grain of the time, so did this particular Muslim man go against the grain or the spirit of a lot of Islam today and risking his life. And I'm sure this guy was not a Zionist or a sympathizer to the Jews ideologically, but the nobility of his character superseded his tribe, his tribal affiliation or his tribal identity. And I just want to applaud that man. So nothing surprised me in this. So yes.
Well, but you've mentioned a couple of things that I do want
Yes.
to comment on. I think people have to understand that Muslim children are indoctrinated from a young age. They go to a madrasa of some kind, and from kindergarten or even earlier, they are indoctrinated to hate Jews and
That's right.
Christians, to hate the West. That is part of their education from so young
Yes.
that it's hard to imagine a child so educated in that manner
You're right.
growing up to have any other opinion of Jews and Christians than what's been drummed into his head for a decade or more of childhood and post-childhood education. So when they grow up, they've already been indoctrinated to the fact that you and I and people in America and people in the Anglosphere, as you call it, are evil and deserve to be killed, annihilated in one way or another. So that is part of the education of young Muslims over in their country. And when they come to our country, that education does not just magically vanish.
That's right. That's right.
That's the problem.
That's correct.
It's not like they learn that a certain color doesn't go good with their
Right.
shoes, and they can change it when they come here, or anything like that. This is part of their psyche that has been drummed into them from early childhood. And then when they emigrate to another country, it comes with him. So maybe one or two by themselves could be convinced maybe that they're wrong. But when they come to a foreign land, they don't live among us. They live in their own neighborhoods. And all of this hatred just continues to boil and grow and be verified by each person who says, yes, these are the evil people. We're living in their land, and we're going to do something, and we take over their land. That's part of what happens. They come here, they don't assimilate, and they live in conditions in which the hatred is amplified. The other thing that you mentioned, which I think is important to talk about, is yes, they are small segments of the population. But look what they've been able to do in select cities in the United States. They may be 2% of the overall population, but when they all go to one city,
That's right. That's
they
right.
then become politically forceful. And now there are some cities in the United States that really are kind of Muslim cities.
I mean, look, you have Dearborn, which everybody knows. In the state of New Jersey, there's a place called Patterson. And I remember that's almost like Dearborn. And it's a story that stood out last year was that some of the police of Palestinian extraction wore, instead of American flags on their uniforms, the Palestinian flag. So I don't negate anything you're saying. I agree with what you're saying. And yet, I remember the last time you had me, I gave a scary prognosis to all this, which was, I think you asked me where all this was leading. And I basically said, at least as it relates to Europe, the choice will be very bleak and very severe no matter which choice you make. Either one day in the future, there'll be a civil war, between the native populations of the Europeans that just said enough, England, England's for the English, Sweden's for the Swedes. Or you'll have, in lieu of that, somebody will come to power that says, look, they're not comparable with Western values. We have to denaturalize even the ones that are citizens and send them home. But this current pace in which people, the status quo is not going to last. It's not going to last. And so I don't disagree with anything you're saying. You could argue that places like Dearborn are, it's funny what they accuse Israel of occupied territory is actually what you're seeing in places like Dearborn. I wouldn't go to Dearborn if you paid me to. I wouldn't feel safe there, and I was going to say I wouldn't be caught dead there, but I probably would be caught dead there. There are places now in the United States that I would not go to because they are so saturated and so successfully been taken over by that particular element. So I don't negate anything you're saying. And, is there anybody here in our politics here in the United States that are doing anything about it? Look, God bless him. I think President Trump is doing everything he can constitutionally. Today he just issued a ban not allowing anybody into the country from certain Muslim countries, including the Palestinian Authority, including from the Gaza Strip, the West Bank. That's the most he can try to do constitutionally at the moment. If you remember when he tried to do this in his first term, he was challenged by the Supreme Court. It didn't. Now, he still, thankfully, I think, got away with it. He somehow managed to keep it going somehow. But look, from what I understand, he's aware of it. He's doing his best. It obviously isn't his highest priority. He's also trying to deal with illegal immigrants from Latin America and other places. The whole fentanyl crisis. So I'm not saying that it's at the top of President Trump's awareness, but he is trying. His administration at least is doing something, whereas the other one that preceded him did nothing. So
I think that if we look to Europe, especially Great Britain at this point, I think that's going to be a good prognostication of what could happen here. They're a smaller nation. They have a lot fewer people as their general population, but they are now in a situation where large areas of cities are completely taken over by Muslim immigrants.
That's correct.
And their government is allowing boatload after boatload after boatload of young male Muslims to come into the country. And this has created an awful lot there are many cities now, or many places in some of the major cities of Great Britain where you dare not go. You cannot go because it's just too dangerous.
Right.
They rule those areas. London is a good example. And when that happens, eventually there comes a point where the native population is either going to succumb or act. The main problem that these nations have is that they are unarmed. And I think that is one of the most important differences that we will see. And I think the incident in Australia, in Sydney, Australia, is the same thing. You have a very liberal government there who they want to take away the guns from everyone, except I don't know even who has guns if it's not exactly the military. I don't know if even the police have guns. I know in Great Britain, there's a whole level of police who are completely unarmed. I don't know what good that does. What are you going to say? Stop, or I don't know. What are you
Well,
going to do? I'll yell at you.
I'll be honest with
I'll
you. You
blow
don't.
my whistle. What
You,
am I going to do? You
What's
know,
funny is you don't even need to ask, like, hypothetically, because there's so much footage already in places like X, and YouTube, of the British police being manhandled by these people. Manhandled, a lot. I remember, Dan, hearing, well, I don't want to say exactly where I live, but it was common among the state police in the state where I live, where you had to be, just to qualify to be a state trooper, you had to be 6'2". Me being 5'8" and having some hand-to-hand combat, knowing how to operate a firearm and having military experience, it would still disqualify me because I wouldn't have passed the minimal height test. And they did away with all these requirements, and today in England, none of these requirements exist. You see 5'3", women being tossed around, ragdolled, and they don't have guns, and they're lucky if they even have tasers. So it's insanity. What's taken over the Western world the past few decades is nothing less than insanity. I don't think now, Dan, I'm an historian, as particularly an historian of the ancient world, of ancient Greece, Rome, Israel, and all that stuff. I can't think of any parallel in history of this kind of insanity, where a civilization almost agrees to its own suicide. It's just unparalleled. Uh, it's just insane, and obviously that's what led a lot. That's what caused MAGA basically to come about. And that's part of the popularity of President Trump, was people who said, enough of this insanity. This guy will hopefully try to reverse the insanity. So it's just
but
crazy.
you have to understand, of course, there is an underlying agenda, which is underlying all of these events that are going on, disarming the population, trying to destroy the economy of the United States. That is all part of the desire by the global elite
That's right.
to have world governance through
That's
the
right.
UN. That is what's going on. And we are fighting back finally. There are lots of people in the United States who now recognize this as an issue and are not going to stand for it. And fortunately, we have been able to beat back any effort, uh, except for some peripheral ones, but we've been able to maintain our ability to have self-protection.
Right.
You cannot be free unless you have self-protection. I mean,
I
that's
I
one of
agree.
the basis the basic factors of humanity is you have to be able to protect yourself under
And
all
you know
sorts.
what? It's not even just to protect yourself. It's almost like becoming to the point where it's a civic duty to protect your neighbor. Love your neighbor in the Bible. Um, yeah, you could
Love
say
your
that.
neighbor as thyself, protect thy neighbor
Yeah,
as
you could say
thyself.
that
So,
umbrella expands to include underneath it what we just talked about. I would say that everybody here in the States that has that concealed carry permit should exercise that right, not just to defend themselves, but look, there's people who are. I remember when the October 7 attack happened, immediately I said to myself, my gosh, that could happen here in the United States. And that was my immediate intuition. Then over the last couple years, I've heard people that have a greater expertise than me on what's happening here in the United States from a security point of view, people with like homeland security backgrounds, who will tell you that, during the Biden years, thousands and thousands of people who are likely terrorists, the last figure I heard, and this was a conservative figure, 15,000, made it in through the border. But then you also have people that came here legally through the Canadian border, because Canada lets almost anybody in. Canada doesn't screen any of these people. I told you they have the third largest population of the Islamic Brotherhood in the world, after Qatar and Egypt. Some of them are here on student visas, and we have to believe that there are terror cells, there are sleeper cells here. There's no way in a country this large. Now, they just caught a terror attack in progress that was meant for New Year's Eve in Los Angeles. And it wasn't even Middle Easterners. It was homegrown American Marxists, people that belong to a group called the Turtle Island Liberation. Turtle Island being the Native American name for North America, for what is the United States, Turtle Island. So these are people that don't even believe the United States should exist, who 5 of them were arrested in Los Angeles before executing a mass casualty terror attack. Paris, France, another country, of course, they canceled their New Year's Eve celebrations this year because of warnings. So it is going to come to our shores, and we must have the ability to defend ourselves and our neighbors. I feel like it's our civic duty to do so. That it's one of our highest callings, actually, as citizens, if you're able to do that. So yeah, I agree with you on that. That is what makes the United States set apart. That is part of American exceptionalism. And what's funny is the citizens of all those countries tend to mock America for it. But maybe one day they'll see it in action. Should there be a mass attack, and I'm talking about several attacks concurrently in the United States. That's what I heard the plan is, to unleash, multiple October 7, or, the beach thing that just happened in Australia, throughout the country at one time, that just overwhelms the police here to be able to arrive immediately and deal with it. So yeah, thank God for the Second Amendment, and thank God that most states, including the one I live in, it's quite easy to get the permission to be a concealed carry person. And I think everyone who can should, and everyone who is should exercise that right at all times, knowing it may never be about somebody bullying you or trying to kill you because of road rage, and all the reasons that people tend to carry, but rather, no, this is really, you are the police. You are the first line of defense in this country, in such a situation. And therefore it is your civic duty, to be the armed militia, of the country, ready to respond should such an event. And I think such an event will happen here.
I share your concern because I think it is inevitable at some point that this type of an attack will be tried in this country. Because you're right, during the Obama and the Biden years, numerous terrorists were allowed to come into this country. And who knows where they are? We don't. No one knows where they are. Either they're hiding in cities or wherever. But the fact that they are here and that they probably are meeting together to make plans, um, is what everyone should understand, that we are all at risk here.
And that what happened in Australia, in light of what could happen here, was amateur hour, Dan. Amateur hour. This was a father and son, in all likelihood, lone wolves, not part of some coordinated plan. I mean, I'm talking about something levels higher than what we saw in Australia happening here. And we're talking maybe suicide vests, along with their other weapons. It's going to get ugly here. And yeah, we have to be very vigilant.
So it really transcends anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. It's a war against the West. What it
Right.
is we, the Jews, are just the gateway drug. They start with us, but then they go up the ladder to get everybody else. And that's what so look, someone who's listening to this who says, well, I don't care, it's the Jews, that's their problem. So if you were to say to me, well, Steve, sell it to them that it's their problem too, I would say, yeah, it begins with the Jews, but it swallows up everybody else. We tend, that's that whole canary in the coal mine that you mentioned. We tend to be the first victims to these ideologies, but then they come for everybody else. And that's why people should be concerned. Now you could argue in this country that the first wave was probably that Black Lives Matter. A couple. I just got to take a drink here real quick. You could say that it really started a couple years ago with Black Lives Matter, and that the Palestinian stuff that happened since 2023 was part 2 of that, the latest manifestation of that spirit of anarchy, and that symbiosis between Marxism and Islamism. Uh, and that second wave is not yeah, go ahead.
The red-green axis.
That red-green axis, yeah. So it just shape shifts at times, Um, but and look, we haven't seen yet what becomes in New York when Mamdani takes over. So that's yet to be seen. So look, we live in scary times, but I am a believer, as you know, and you are a believer, and it's sometimes it's in the darkness that the light of our faith shines brightest. But I would say anybody who tells you that this country's best days are ahead of it, they're lying to you. Whenever I hear that, every politician feels to have to say that, our best days are ahead of us. No, they're not. Our best days are behind us because we're living in a time of increasing spiritual darkness. People have to understand that and this is another subject that maybe you'll breach or broach, whatever the right word is of the two. There's a spiritual side to all this. I see it play out on social media every day, and I'll tell you where a lot of your people listening to this will find interesting, because it does include them, which is you're seeing a revival over the past couple years. Again, I would say the October 7 attacks of Israel were like the great trigger to a lot of these things. It just unleashed so many of these trends. One of those trends is what I call the rise of Gnostic Jesus, as opposed to the real biblical Jesus. Gnostic Jesus is this movement to remove Jesus from the Old Testament and the God of the Old Testament and the God of the Jews. It's almost like Jesus is a separate and distinct God from Yahweh, the God of the Jews. And in fact, Christians who since subscribe to this worldview, you can tell they have a strong dislike for the Jewish part of the Bible. And if they could, they would, truncate it off. And they consider anybody who sort of elevates the Old Testament as equal to the New Testament, or anyone who considers the New Testament to be a sequel rather than a replacement of the Old Testament, they belittle as, Christian Zionists. You're automatically termed a Christian Zionist, or what they call dispensationalist. And you heard Tucker Carlson say that he hates those people more than any tribe in the world. In other words, Tucker Carlson hates those kind of Christians. And this includes many people listening to the two of us right now. And this is why this subject really does matter. It's not just a Jewish problem. What it is you have a lot of evangelical Christians in this country who will be considered guilty by association, because they'll be considered an extension of the Jews, because they believe in the Jewish deity Yahweh, and they believe in the eternal faithfulness of the deity Yahweh. They believe that Jesus fulfilled the covenants, not replaced the covenants. This is crucial stuff. And again, I know a lot of the people listening to this, most of them probably fall on the side that is accused of being Christian Zionists, but I'm sure you have people that listen to the show that are perhaps on the other side. And this is really a spiritual civil war with serious repercussions for the country. So it's not like all this is happening in a vacuum. There's an incredible spiritual, and I don't want to sound, I'm not some Pentecostal, so I hate to use the term spiritual warfare, because when you say that, people think you're making doing exorcisms in the house or whatever, against a demon under your bed. But there is some truth that you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is such a thing as spiritual warfare. And unfortunately, as America's become more and more biblically illiterate, as more and more people don't make time for the Bible, and I mean reading the Bible from cover to cover, they become vulnerable to falling to the false gospel of the false Jesus.
Well, the important thing to realize is that if you do read the full Bible, you understand that Jesus was foretold in multiple books of the Old Testament. So he did not appear as a vacuum out of nothing. Yahweh in the Bible says, here are the things that are going to happen. The book of Ezekiel and Isaiah and Daniel, they all prophesize what happened to Jesus. So yes, the Bible is a totality, Old and New Testament. It's really pretty plain to see if you go to the trouble of
Sure.
reading it.
Although I'll just take it one notch further, which is to say, most of them wouldn't deny what you said that, there's Isaiah 53 and there's what they call Christology. Christology is that which predicted Jesus's coming. But they only accept the Christology that prophesies Jesus's first coming. Now that he's come, a lot of them don't believe in the bulk of the prophecy of the Bible, which is related to his second coming. And for those of us who read the Bible, whether we like it or not, his second coming is a very Israel-centric event. And that's what turns off a lot of these people, a lot of these detractors. They can't stand the idea that God is still he's still the Yahweh national deity of Israel. He's still the one that set aside, and that's all chosen people means. Doesn't mean better. He's still the Yahweh who set aside the Jewish people forever for his particular purposes, including up until this very day and beyond this day, for setting the stage for when Jesus returns. And those people resent that. It's in my opinion the number one cause of what's popularly called anti-Semitism is this resentment towards the chosen people election of the Jews. They resent that, but God doesn't care whether they resent it. It is biblical truth. And sometimes we make the mistake as people that live in democracies. We think that God is part of the democracy. That God bends to the popular will of his petty of these puny humans here on earth. And the truth is no, God's a king, and kings do what they want. And the king has spoken his will, which is that Israel is still the vehicle which plans to use. It's part of his plan of redemption, not just for the Jews, but for the world at large and for his future reign on earth. So that's part of the spiritual warfare. The Bible does teach clearly that as we get closer to that time, the devil knows, the Bible says this, the devil knows his time is short. So as he gets closer to the appointed time of his end, he rages with all the more fury. And those are the days we're living in as we get closer to that appointed time, the spiritual battle here in America, and you're seeing it play out since Charlie Kirk's death. Charlie's murder, I want to make sure I'm clear about that. Charlie's murder, his assassination, kicked off what may be a phenomenal revival among the young people of this country. I noticed it when I watched the memorial service on TV. I couldn't get over how anointed this ceremony was. Hours of just anointed worship, anointed preaching. The gospel was communicated to over 100 million people around the globe. I don't think there was ever an outreach like that in the history of that gospel. But you notice that shortly thereafter, because just like when God has something he wants to do, his enemy is out to shadow it and to destroy it. As soon as this revival started to break forth, then you saw this ugly war over the legacy of Charlie, people fighting over who really was Charlie. Popular podcasters accusing his wife and the organization of being behind it and trying to totally rob the momentum of the revival from continuing. So I think Charlie's murder was a huge event, not just in American history, but I'm sorry, not just in American political history, but in America's spiritual history. I would say Charlie Kirk's murder was a major event, and maybe one day, depending on how it plays out, we'll look back at a great awakening that may have been taken. The story's yet to be told about what happens in the aftermath of Charlie's assassination, but that too has kicked off this like spiritual warfare. You see, it's like when I'm not claiming obviously that Charlie was Moses by any means, but there is this parallel in the New Testament where we learn that when Moses died, Satan fought with God over the body of Moses. It's almost like since Charlie was murdered, there's this fight over his legacy. There's attempts to take over the USA by hostile elements, by this group, the Groypers, which I think you and I talked about maybe in our last talk, the Fuentes people. So I just wanted to get that spiritual warfare in as well, that everything you and I are talking about, including the Islamic threat to the world, to the Western world, is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because both the leaders of these Western countries, as well as the populace at large, have fallen into a spiritual slumber. I guarantee that the American forefathers of 100 years ago would not have permitted this invasion of the country, because they would have had the spiritual discernment that comes with faith and being immersed in scripture, as most of America's founding generations were. I mean, you only have to go back a couple generations, maybe to the World War II era, to a generation that was saturated in scripture. But as America becomes less and less saturated in scripture, and fortunately, therefore less and less discerning, that's how all this has been able to transpire. So I never want to leave out the spiritual part. It is part of the story, and most people won't address it, obviously, especially on secular media, because to them it's a bunch of crock. But I know that you yourself and many of your listeners do take stuff like this seriously. We are Bible believers, and we can't leave that part out of the story.
Well, Charlie Kirk is a very important part of this entire scenario that's playing out. There's no question about it. And immediately how important he was by how vigorously they tried to tear down his legacy. That's a clue right there.
That's
If
right.
he was just a passing fancy, he would be gone and forgotten. But he's not, because he is a major risk to the powers who want to destroy this nation.
That's right.
That's why they are fighting the way they are. They would rather none of us remember him.
That's
But
right.
fortunately, that's not going to happen, because remembering someone like that goes a lot deeper than just what you read on Facebook today.
Right.
His followers and the ones who became his followers and devotees because of his assassination, that stays in their heart forever. It's part of their being forever. That's why he's going to be known as such a pivotal character in this stage of American history.
Yes. And look, I read statistics that since his murder, there's been this explosion of these Generation Zers buying Bibles, and hopefully they're reading these Bibles. I really do hope they're reading them from cover to cover. That's the beginning of wisdom. The Bible clearly says the beginning of wisdom is the reverent fear of Yahweh. It's not some reverent fear of some generic higher power. It is the specific deity of the Bible. And like I said, unfortunately, there is a tribe of Christians trying to divorce Jesus from that particular deity of the Bible. And a Jesus who's divorced from Yahweh is no longer the true Jesus or historical Jesus. And I just think that's a point that I wanted to really push in this.
Well, that's an important point, because at the time, Jesus was a Jew and he was a devotee of his father, Yahweh. And that's what he talked about. He did not talk about that he was something. He never talked about him being something apart and separate
Right.
from the Father.
Right.
He was an emissary
Right.
and part of the Father. And that was his role, and that's what he spoke about continually on earth.
But I'm gonna say, but Dan, I'm gonna say something that may even rock you. I would say I wouldn't even say Jesus was a Jew. You know what I would say? Jesus is a Jew, and he returns as a Davidic king, as the Davidic king, as the King of Kings. So he hasn't changed who he is, and he never will change who he is.
Gotcha. And that's incredible. That really is, because he is of the lineage of David.
He's the Lion of Judah.
Yes.
Right.
Of course. So I think we've covered this subject pretty well tonight. What do you think?
I agree with you. I always love to leave things hanging on a spiritual theme, just to give the audience something to think about and hopefully strive towards.
I think that's important. This is a spiritual battle, a battle between good and evil at its very, very core, where Yahweh is good and Satan is evil. And the two of them they have their proponents or whatever. And we know that Satan is very active because there's certainly a lot of evil going on. But I have faith that Yahweh will of course, be the one who triumphs, because that's good and that's what's written.
Well, if I may close by wishing everybody who's listening to us a happy Hanukkah, if that's what they celebrate, a Merry Christmas, if that's what they celebrate. It's really my favorite time of the year. And don't forget the reason for the season, folks.
And God bless you very much, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Good night now.
Good night.